Politics in the Lone Star State are getting weird. The governor and the state attorney general are threatening to expel more than a third of the elected members of the state House of Representatives. A U.S. senator is demanding that the FBI bring criminal charges against them. And now the FBI is saying that it will be playing bounty hunter and possibly tracking down Texas Democratic lawmakers and forcing them to return to their home state. This whole kerfuffle started back in June when President Trump demanded that Texas redraw its congressional maps before the 2026 midterms to give Republicans 5 more seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. According to Trump, they, quote, deserve it. Okay, first of all, that's just not true. 2024 was a personal best for Trump in Texas since he's run for president 3 times. But George W. Bush, who was, after all, governor of Texas, beat his record twice, and Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts, beat him too. I mean, it's physically possible to draw a map of Texas with fewer Democratic representatives. It can be done. In fact, it was done in 2021 after the last U.S. Census. But claiming that the president has a right to demand a mid-cycle redraw of congressional maps because he won the state is, I mean, let's just say it's not how we were taught this was supposed to go in the Schoolhouse Rock videos about separation of powers and checks and balances. But Texas Republicans said, giddy up. We're now in the middle of a Texas-sized cluster that looks miles away from resolution. So saddle up, we're headed to Austin. Gerrymandering is drawing electoral maps to favor one particular party or group. Essentially, it allows that group to punch above its weight, netting more seats than it would with a map that allowed for proportional representation. The word is a portmanteau of Jerry and salamander, named for Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, who in 1812 signed off on a map of Boston that had a partisan district shaped like a salamander. Gerry went on to be vice president under James Madison, but that's not what anyone remembers him for. Gerrymandering is traditionally accomplished by cracking and packing. That is, you spread the voters from the disfavored group out among as many districts as possible to crack their vote share, and you pack all the rest of them into as few districts as possible. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, Republicans make up 38% of registered voters but hold 6 out of 8 congressional seats, or 25%. And in fact, Texas is already gerrymandered, with Democrats making up 46% of registered voters while holding just 12 of 38 congressional seats. One of the ways Republicans accomplished this in 2021 was by cracking big cities, which are a traditional Democratic stronghold. Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio were all sliced up like a pie into at least 5 congressional districts. Austin, the state capital and the smallest city on that list with fewer than 1 million residents, is cut up into 6 districts, and that's not an accident. That's gerrymandering. What Trump is demanding is for Republicans in Texas to gerrymander the state more. In June, the New York Times reported that Trump called up Abbott and made the demand as part of an effort to hold the House for Republicans in the 2026 midterms. Quote, it appeared to be driven in part by President Trump's concern that the Republican Party could lose its slim majority in the House, derailing the second half of his term and empowering Democratic investigations of his administration. Which sounds pretty unfair, right? But is it illegal? In a word, no. Beginning in the 1960s, the Supreme Court faced voter challenges to various efforts by state legislatures to dilute the votes of their political opponents. In Alabama, for example, the state legislature refused to reapportion their state legislative districts for 6 decades using maps that were drawn in 1903. That meant some districts had 41 times as many residents as others, even though each district elected just 1 state senator. And the Supreme Court said that violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the principle of one person, one vote. Chief Justice Earl Warren ordered Alabama to redraw its legislative districts to make things more fair because as long as ours is a representative form of government and our legislatures are those instruments of government elected directly by and directly representative of the people, the right to elect legislators in a free and unimpaired fashion is a bedrock of our political system. In a 1986 case challenging Indiana's state legislative districts, the Supreme Court held that political gerrymandering was justiciable, meaning that yes, courts could strike down electoral maps when one party tries to redraw legislative districts in such a way as to disadvantage the other party. The issue the Supreme Court wrestled with wasn't, is political gerrymandering illegal? Because of course it was, but rather, how can we tell whether illegal gerrymandering has occurred? In that case, captioned Davis v. Bandemer, the Supreme Court said that voters needed to show both an intent by the legislature to discriminate against their political party and an actual discriminatory effect on that group. But measuring that effect was the biggest challenge because, remember, this was in the days before you could just tell ChatGPT to draw you a map of the country that awarded every single congressional district to one party. The courts were skeptical that gerrymandering was always to blame for a mismatch between voter identification and statewide results. Like, what if Democrats were just fielding bad candidates? Or what if bad luck or geography or happenstance or some other permissible factor wound up packing Democrats into fewer congressional districts than their Republican opponents? Like, how can you prove that the results were caused by gerrymandering? But in a 2004 case called Veith v. Jubelrear, the court predicted that those newfangled computers would find a way. It was a very fractured decision, with Justice Antonin Scalia writing for the plurality that the question of whether a district was gerrymandered involved a sea of imponderables, so the Supreme Court shouldn't even try to develop a workable standard. But Justice Anthony Kennedy, the swing vote, figured that computers in the future would probably give us the ability to show exactly how districts were gerrymandered to favor one party and disfavor the other. He said, if suitable standards with which to measure the burden a gerrymander imposes on representational rights did emerge, hindsight would show that the court prematurely abandoned the field. And of course, he was right. Just 10 years later, computers made it trivially easy to show that districts were intentionally gerrymandered to advantage one political party over another. All you have to do is feed all the permissible criteria for drawing a district except partisan advantage into a computer. So you got geography, demographics, protecting incumbents. And then you ask the computer to draw 1,000 maps or 100,000 maps or 1,000,000 maps. And if those maps don't produce the same congressional breakdown by party, then you know for sure that the determinative factor was partisan advantage. So problem solved, right? After the 2010 census, North Carolina redrew its congressional maps. Voter registration in the state was roughly even, and Democrats held 7 of the state's 13 congressional seats. But when the new map was released in 2011, it produced 10 Republican seats and just 3 Democratic ones. Democrats sued. They put on an expert witness who compared the actual map to 3,000 computer-generated ones that didn't try to gerrymander for Republicans, and every single one produced at least 1 more Democratic seat. Most produced 3 or 4 more Democratic seats. But the Roberts Court didn't care. In a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, they ruled that partisan gerrymandering is a non-justiciable political question. The fact that such gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles does not mean that the solution lies with the federal judiciary. We conclude that partisan gerrymandering claims present political questions beyond the reach of federal courts. Their solution was for gerrymandered parties to just vote harder. How are you going to do that if your state legislature is totally gerrymandered to ensure that the politicians who draw the maps are all from the same party? Well, that's your problem. Taking a closer look at specific stories, you see a fascinating breakdown of how attitudes across political divides are rapidly changing. There were 326 reports about Governor Abbott ordering the arrest of the absent Texas House Democrats, with 31% of coverage coming from the left, 45% from the center, and only 23% from the right. On the left, sources mostly frame the story as the Texas governor ordering the arrests. The center sources focused on explaining the context. And on the right, sources largely focused on why the Democrats left in the first place without talking about the nature of arresting them. Now, headlines and coverage vary greatly depending on the source, which is exactly why I love today's sponsor, Ground News. Legal Eaglets get 40% off a Ground News Vantage subscription. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link on the description to claim your discount. The Nobel Peace Center called Ground News an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview, and I could not agree more. They've been a longtime supporter of this channel and of independent journalism at large. So please consider checking them out. Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. These gaps in coverage are exactly why Ground News is my favorite way to stay informed. And just to repeat, Legal Eaglets get 40% off a Ground News Vantage subscription. Scan the code on screen or click the link in the description to start your subscription today. You'll get unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and the blind spot feed. And by subscribing, you are also supporting an independent platform that's trying to make the media landscape more transparent and balanced. So scan the QR code or click the link below, and after that, click right here for more LegalEagle, or we will see you in court. So partisan gerrymandering is now legal, but a lot of people don't like it because it feels unfair and undemocratic to allow politicians to pick their voters rather than the other way around. There's also the glaringly obvious fact that the easiest way to spot the Democrats when you're drawing a gerrymandered map is to code for minority voters. Trump made a lot of gains, particularly with black voters, but he still took just 15% of black voters in 2024. So a lot of gerrymanders get challenged because they illegally dilute the voting power of minorities in violation of the Voting Rights Act. And red states defend those gerrymanders by saying, oh, we weren't trying to reduce the representation of minorities, we were trying to reduce the representation of Democrats. And the Supreme Court said that's okay. So to fight back, after the Russo decision, several states enacted laws mandating that electoral maps be drawn by an independent redistricting committee. But Texas was not one of them. And in 2021, the Republican-dominated legislature locked in a GOP advantage in the U.S. House of Representatives, thanks in part to that crazy map of Austin. Remember, 46% of registered voters in Texas are Democrats, but they're netting just 37% of seats. That's a pretty substantial gerrymander, but now Trump is worried about the midterms, so he ordered Governor Greg Abbott to find him 5 more seats, reducing Democratic representation to just 24%. That's some pretty substantial disenfranchisement. Abbott initially expressed reluctance to redraw the map again since it was already redrawn during the normal cycle in 2021 after the 2020 census. But then the Justice Department stepped in to provide him with an excuse. See, the Texas GOP has claimed that the maps were race blind in accordance with federal law. That's been the subject of a lot of litigation. But this summer, the DOJ sent Abbott a letter calling 4 majority-minority congressional districts around Houston and Fort Worth unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. The theory here is that the map is actually racist against white voters. For the record, the Justice Department under Biden sued Texas, saying that the 2021 maps deliberately disenfranchised minority voters, and Texas fought that claim tooth and nail. But this time, Abbott set a special session agenda calling for mid-cycle redistricting in light of constitutional concerns raised by the U.S. Department of Justice. The governor called a special session of the legislature for the 3rd week of July, and Texas Democrats showed up initially. Let's let Texas House Representative Jolanda Jones walk us through what went down.
We had 3 sham hearings with no maps, where people were forced to testify that they were neutral on the maps because of our processes, when actually, I would say about 99.9% of the people were against it.
So Republicans claimed not to have the maps ready during the time for public comment and then produced them just hours before the committee was supposed to vote on them, at which point the Texas Democrats walked out and left the state, depriving the legislature of a quorum. A quorum is the minimum number of members present required to do business. And that makes sense, right? You don't want like 10 legislators to be able to walk into the chamber, gavel in, and then pass laws. Article 3, Section 10 of the Texas State Constitution defines a quorum as 2/3 of the total number of elected members. So for the Texas House, which is 150 members, that's obviously 100. There are 62 Democratic members, and if 51 of them don't show up, there's no quorum, and the legislature can't do any business other than trying to compel the attendance of absent members. Now, this isn't the first time Texas Dems have fled the state to break quorum. In 2021, when Abbott was trying to jam through those super not racist maps, they left for several weeks, and it is not illegal to break quorum. The Texas House rules allow the body to censure or even expel members who refuse to show up upon a 2/3 vote. But that's a House rule. It's not a law. But look, people have jobs and lives and kids they want to see, and eventually the Democrats came home to their families and the Republicans got their maps through. Then in 2023, the Texas House enacted a rule change imposing a $500 daily fine for breaking quorum. And by the way, Texas House members work part-time. They get just $600 a month, along with a per diem of $221, but only on days that the House is in session, which is typically 6 months every other year, plus whatever 30-day emergency sessions the governor calls. No one is getting rich off this job. So this time, Texas Democrats knew they were going to have to plan ahead to pay those fines, and they immediately started both fundraising and meeting with blue state governors, especially Governor J.B. Pritzker in Illinois, who happens to be a billionaire. And they got the money they needed to camp out in other states to block quorum, so this map can't be voted on. So the first thing that happened after Democrats broke quorum was that the Texas House issued civil arrest warrants for the missing Democrats on August 3rd. Those civil warrants gave state troopers and the chamber's sergeant-at-arms the power to round up the missing legislators and bring them to the Capitol. But those warrants are no good out of state, which is why Democrats are holed up in Illinois, New York, and Massachusetts. So far, so normal. Everyone knew that the Texas Republicans would go after Texas Democrats for breaking quorum, but Texas Republicans are now laying into each other, and it is wild. Governor Abbott got the ball rolling by vowing to seek a court order declaring that the Democratic legislators had abandoned their offices if they didn't return by August 4. He also accused them of violating state bribery laws by raising money to pay the $500 daily fines.
Yeah, no, abandoning your job is going to Cancun in the middle of a deadly freeze, right? Abandoning your job is cutting health care when people need access. Abandoning your job is cutting public education when we already have one of the worst education systems in the nation. What we are doing is the fundamental protection by our founding fathers in the Texas Constitution.
Now, the Texas Supreme Court is pretty well aligned with Governor Abbott. The justices are elected statewide, which means that they are all Republicans. And in cases of retirement, the governor gets to appoint an immediate replacement. But Abbott did not point to any particular court case in support of his right to kick the Democratic legislators out of office. Instead, he pointed to an opinion letter that Attorney General Ken Paxton wrote in 2021 during the last quorum break. Paxton said in the letter that if a legislator is believed to have forfeited his or her office by abandonment, the attorney general or the county or district attorney of the proper county may initiate a suit in district court seeking a judgment removing the person from office. So on Tuesday, August 5th, Abbott filed an emergency petition for a writ of quo warranto in the Texas Supreme Court against Representative Jean Wu, the minority leader of the Texas House. A quo warranto action is a common law remedy which challenges the right of an official to hold office. So Abbott is asking the Supreme Court to say that Wu has forfeited his office by abandoning it and leaving the state, and thus he's not a member of the Texas House anymore. The court has given Representative Wu until Friday to file his response. But then Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton leapt in with a letter to the court saying that only he has the authority to bring a quo warranto action against these legislators, not Abbott. Incidentally, Paxton barely showed up for his own impeachment trial, so it's more than a little bit hypocritical for him to huff and puff about Democrats shirking their responsibility to the chamber. Anyway, Paxton said he's waiting to file until Friday, August 8th, the deadline the Republican House Speaker has set for the Democratic legislators to return. But he said that the court shouldn't dismiss Abbott's case. It should just, hold on till Friday and then let Paxton bust in like the Kool-Aid man and take over as plaintiff. Abbott fired back that he's actually not relying on the same statute as Paxton, so he does too get to be the one to bring this quo warranto action against the missing Democrats. We'll see what the Texas Supreme Court says about declaring the office vacant because lawmakers have abandoned it. There's no precedent for that before, although they are the highest court in the land. I expect that any evicted lawmakers would certainly appeal to a federal court, but we're in uncharted territory here.
There is no felony in the Texas Penal Code for what he says. So respectfully, he's making up some okay? He's trying to get sound bites, and he has no legal mechanism. And if he did, subpoenas from Texas don't work in New York, so he gonna come get us how? Subpoenas in Texas don't work in Chicago. He's gonna come get us how?
Now, Paxton has a pretty good reason for wanting to raise his political profile since he's challenging sitting U.S. Senator John Cornyn for his seat next year. And in a one-party state, you have to outflank your opponent by running to the right to beat him in a primary, which is exactly what Paxton has done. But Cornyn also has a pretty good reason to try and beef up his crazy cred, which he did in a letter to FBI Director Kash Patel asking the federal law enforcement agency to track down and arrest the Texas lawmakers. That should have been rejected out of hand, since Texas Democrats aren't violating federal law. They're not even violating state law. They're violating the internal rules of the Texas State House of Representatives. But Cornyn says that the fundraising appeals may violate federal bribery laws, and thus the FBI should go track these Democrats down and drag them back to Texas. Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker has some thoughts about that one, but according to Cornyn, Kash Patel agreed to do it, although there appears to be some ambiguity as to whether the FBI will just be finding those lawmakers, which won't be hard since they're not hiding, or actually arresting them and dragging them back to Texas, which would be a gross abuse of federal authority. No one thinks that civil warrants issued by the Texas House for infractions of its own political rules are enforceable across state lines. This has the potential to get real ugly fast. I cannot think of any possible legal justification for the FBI to go chasing down state lawmakers for violating political rules of their state house. Texas's threat to redistrict has sparked threats by California, New York, Illinois, and Maryland to redraw their own maps to offset any partisan gains made by Texas. Meanwhile, the president just posted on social media that he instructed our Department of Commerce to immediately begin work on a new and highly accurate census based on modern-day facts and figures, and importantly, using the results and information gained from the presidential election of 2024. People who are in our country illegally will not be counted in the census. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Okay, that's a lot. But briefly, the Constitution and federal law provide for a decennial census, that's every 10 years, not one that the president declares spontaneously whenever he wants. Preparations are already underway for the 2030 census, which is a huge undertaking. The 14th Amendment requires enumeration of the whole number of persons in each state, regardless of their citizenship status. And I have no idea what he means by information gained from the presidential election of 2024. Then again, we're talking about a guy who randomly wanders out onto the roof of the White House, so maybe he doesn't know either. I think it would be appropriate to give the last word here to Texas Representative Jolanda Jones.
When the litigation happens, because it's going to happen, trust and believe, right? That there will be testimony saying that everybody was neutral on it, which is, excuse my French, a damn lie. Then, when they got the map on Wednesday, and let me be clear, it was the worst kept secret in Texas. I was on the redistricting committee, and I was wondering in January, why am I on the redistricting committee? I mean, it ain't a redistricting year. And we didn't meet once, right? But this was always the backup plan. Always. I sat in on the hearings. It was a joke.
Thanks, Chief Justice Roberts.
God, I hate that bit so much. Now, mind you, I don't hate Liz or the fact that we've turned that into a bit, but I hate that it's such a thing that we had to turn it into a bit. Now, the one thing that I'll add is that in addition to it not being a crime, it's important to note that legislators leaving the chamber or state is a long-standing American tradition in politics. Abe Lincoln once jumped out of a window to prevent a quorum in Illinois. The Illinois State Register reported that he, quote, very unceremoniously opened the window and jumped out, followed by one or two other members. In modern history, no one has walked out more than Oregon Republicans, who have decamped at least 10 times, most recently in 2023, when they left for 6 weeks. None of them were ever arrested or threatened to be arrested. Legislators in Nebraska, Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Rhode Island have also staged legislative walkouts. And although Texas Republicans are saying it's a grievous injury to democracy when legislators don't show up for work, that's exactly what House Speaker Mike Johnson did when he adjourned the House early in order to avoid anything about the Epstein files. And recently, Texas Republicans have made it clear that they're not looking to compromise with their Democratic colleagues. They want arrests and expulsion. Just the other day, Paxton filed a lawsuit in Illinois arguing the full faith and credit clause means that Illinois state courts have to enforce the civil warrants issued by the Texas House. Paxton filed the case in Adams County, which is more than 4 hours away from the Chicago suburbs where the Texas legislators are staying. And I probably don't need to tell you why. Adams County voted for Trump by 47 percentage points, whereas DuPage County voted for Kamala Harris by 14 points. And there's yet more going on. Not to be outdone, Governor Greg Abbott asked the Texas Supreme Court to expel Houston Representative Gene Wu, chair of the House Democratic Caucus, from office. Abbott argued that breaking quorum is the equivalent of vacating one's office, though it looks like this is the wrong venue and is against centuries of precedent, but it's Texas, so who knows. Meanwhile, the Texas House is set to reconvene and they have set a deadline for the Democrats to return. But if they do decide to go back to Texas, they're going to need a good lawyer. And speaking of good lawyers, here's the lead partner of the great firm, the Eagle team. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I I talk about on this channel: transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do, to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.